Welcome to the Neophytes of Narratology, the internet's most pretentious and pseudo-intellectual pursuit since, perhaps, Nietzsche's thus podcast Zarathustra, or Camus' renowned Vlog of Sisyphus. While lesser men aspire to stand on the shoulders of mere giants, we at the Lost Signals will accept nothing less than titans. So join us as we delve into the fundamentals of narrative nuance and critique the critics who proclaim to know the universal qualities of effective storytelling. Welcome back to Neophytes of Narratology. Jonathan Ian Manzer here with Scott Thurla.
Hello.
And Stephen Ramosi.
How are you?
So, while searching for the next work on literary criticism and narrative structure, I stumbled upon an article from The Guardian where John Sutherland gave a list of his favorite and what he considered the best works on narratology and literary criticism there were.
Did he use the term narratology?
No, I believe it just was literary criticism, but I like narratology, so there we go. It actually started off with our last work, Aristotle's Poetics.
Mm-hmm.
So I went with his second one, which was Susan Sontag's 1966 work, Against Interpretation. Steve-O, would you like to give a little brief overview of who Susan Sontag is, or was, I should say?
Yeah, well, she was a really well-known author, I believe in probably the 70s is when she kind of rose to prominence. This is a book of her essays that she wrote between her first two novels. We're just doing the first essay in here, Against Interpretation, but she wrote, I think, 4 novels overall, and a lot of essays about various things, including literature, how to interpret art, these types of things. And I know one of her most well-known ones was a book about photography that people keep telling me that I should definitely read, and I have not yet. This was actually the first thing I believe that any of us have read by Susan Sontag.
I had recognized her name, but this is my first experience with anything she had done.
Right,
so.
Right, exactly. So, I mean, that's kind of, she's won a bunch of awards. She's a very well-known, well-respected critic, even though she, insofar as what we've read to this point, doesn't really like criticism as it stands.
And criticism as an idea as well.
So now we get to become critics of critics of criticism.
It's recursive in a sense.
So yeah, I mean, that's kind of what I know about her. I'm definitely interested in reading more at this point, but this is our start. This is our portal into her world.
Now, there's a foreword in this work. I did not read it because I wanted to go in completely blind to her opinion. I didn't want to find out much about her. In a sense, I didn't want any outside influence influencing my interpretation of her work. So even though it's against interpretation...
In order to be against interpretation, Ian decided not to be their interpretation.
So both Stephen and Scott read the foreword, so would you like to give a little brief synopsis of that?
Sure. Well, the reason we're even mentioning this, as I brought it up, whether or not we should discuss it, is that I'll read it to you. There's one passage in the foreword where she says, "I disagree now with a portion of what I wrote, but it's not the sort of disagreement that makes feasible partial changes or revisions. Although I think I overestimated or underestimated the merit of several works I discussed, little of my present disagreement owes to a shift in particular judgments. Anyway, what value these essays may possess, the extent to which they are more than just case studies of my evolving sensibility, rests not on the specific appraisals made, but on the interestingness of the problems raised," which I think is fair. But I think the only point I wanted to talk about in regards to this is that given that she outright admits that certain points that she may not quite agree with, but overall it stands. I think she's saying the core of it is still solid, and she still agrees with a large portion of it. But I thought it was interesting, and I usually do read forwards, and that's the part that sort of struck out at me.
I mean, it kind of comes through as like this was her kind of working her way through how to interpret art and how to deal with the interpretations of art as they stand in the world.
Or stop interpreting art, as we may say the point of her essay is. But let's go on.
Now, the section starts out with 2 quotes, which I will read off. "Content is a glimpse of something, an encounter like a flash. It's very tiny content." And that is from Willem de Kooning, who I had never heard of, but I looked it up. He's a Dutch abstract painter. And then the second one is, it is only shallow people who do not judge by appearances. The mystery of the world is the visible, not the invisible. And that's Oscar Wilde.
I've never heard of him.
Yeah.
Go on.
I didn't even bother looking up who that was. And I think that both of those quotes provide a good forward, in a sense, to her main thesis.
They give you a sense of what her theme is going to be. Yes, I agree with that.
Right.
So
I think that's why she chose them, of course. But
yeah,
I mean, they're well done, and they sort of are a nice little precursor to what she's about to write about.
So the essay is divided up into 10 sections. So we're going to go section by section, detailing what is said there, and interpreting what her message may have been.
Which she would hate us for, let's be clear about that.
To be forewarned on this, I disagreed with a majority of her points here. Like, I want to be petty about this, almost. So I apologize in advance that this is going to be the most professionally done analysis. So section 1. It begins with a presupposition that at some segment of time, art was completely free from interpretation. It has this ritualistic, this kind of magical, this powerful, emotive significance that really didn't need.
It's sort
to
of
have
primal and has no other layers to it. Yes,
and it strikes me as a unrealistic ideal, almost like a kind of a Garden of Eden of art. That like this is something that we lost at one point, and we need to, and we suffer from that loss.
Well, I agree with that, and let's start off with the very first sentence of Against Interpretation, which reads: "The earliest experience of art must have been that it was incantory, magical. Art was an instrument of ritual." It must have been that, like you said, she presupposes it, phrased as such. And maybe that's true, but it's sort of as if she's taken it as a complete given and then using it as a basis, at least for some of what she's going to say.
Well, I don't know if I can disagree with. I mean, perhaps the phrasing of saying "must have been," but I don't know if I disagree with the fact that that's the case. You know,
I will totally disagree with that because she brings up cave paintings, and in order to understand that it is an antelope and a hunter, you're interpreting those markings as having a message. Unless someone instructs you, unless the creator is there to instruct you to what he drew, there's an element of interpretation.
You're saying sort of by default, which I would agree with, yes, in a sense.
And perhaps the intent wasn't to have a deeper meaning behind showing, but I've heard otherwise. I've heard statements about cave paintings being instructional. This is like tribal.
That's how to hunt the antelope.
Yeah, exactly. These are creatures to fear. Sure. These are like so. Again,
here be monsters and saber-toothed tigers.
It feels that there's kind of an idealistic attachment to this. You were shrugging your shoulders and rolling your eyes.
No, I'm not.
Was.
I'm not certain. This. So the idea of this is the idea of original art is to make something that is concrete into something that is not concrete, right? So I believe she talks about in like early on the painting of a bed being no good to sleep on or something like that. And
well, that's what Plato said.
Right. So this is what she's arguing with, the idea that art does not have to be I want to say constructive, but that's not exactly what I want to say. That art doesn't have to be just a depiction of something that you see. It is a depiction of how the artist feels about something that they see.
But to go to her point, though, while I might agree with that with modern type thing, to go to her point on the earliest forms of art, I believe that, especially, so she goes on to talk about how the Greek philosophy, which is that Plato, and she goes into Plato and Aristotle, and Plato had this idea that everything in reality, or everything is imitation of some kind of abstract concept of reality. And so that art is an abstract view of an abstract.
Well, it's an imitation of imitation, yes, what she says.
Right.
But if it is an imitation, it is not the perfect reality. So my argument is that there is a level of interpretation required for you to see an abstract and interpret it as what reality is intending to mimic.
Sure. I mean, again, I get what she's trying to say, but phrased as it is, and about the example she uses, we just spent 20 minutes basically disagreeing with the very first sentence of this entire essay. But I mean, I do agree largely with that point, and she uses it as obviously a springboard to launch into what she's going to say about art and interpretation of it in general. It's just that I'm not sure if I agree. It's sort of almost like begging the question in a sense.
Right. Well, I mean, I think the entire idea of this first section is to kind of talk about, and after that is to kind of talk about what the idea is that she's going to try and break down.
Sure.
Towards the end, she says it's still assumed that a work of art is its content, or as it's usually put today, that a work of art by definition says something, which I don't disagree with her that not everything has to say something.
Well, to give that little bit of context, she says that based off of Plato and Aristotle, who both believed that these are reflections, or imitations, that thus, it goes to my point that I mentioned, that everything has to be interpreted and everything has content over, in a sense, just the pure, in a sense that the Greeks were the first to really create this interpretation, and that we've carried that through all our Western tradition. That's
right.
What I got out of the initial.
Well, that's what she's saying in the first part.
Like I said, yeah, she's using that as her base essentially, and saying like a lot of our thought is rooted in this.
But she does also later on kind of clarify what she means by interpretation. Like clearly, everything is interpreted.
Yes, well, I was waiting to bring up that quote. That's in a couple of sections.
Yeah.
But either way,
I don't want to like skip ahead, but also that kind of speaks to what we're talking about here.
Any last thoughts on the first section? So move on a second, and I actually want to read off the first sentence of this. None of us can ever retrieve that innocence before all theory, when art knew no need to justify itself, when one did not ask of a work of art what it said because one knew, or thought one knew, what it did. And this goes to the point that I mentioned. For her entire thesis to work, there had to be a point when art, this ideal existed. This Garden of Eden of art, Paradise Lost, in a way. Make her even angrier at...
But in this case, for what she's saying here, she's talking about each individual person had at some point no like deeper understanding of what a work of art was supposed to mean. They only saw the art as it was, which is kind of her idea of that lost paradise.
Right. She's saying we should get back to that,
in each one of us, and like she's just, I think what she's trying to say is that we should all try to view art as though we're innocent to the things surrounding it. Which, by the way, in interpreting this essay, that she also says later should be considered its own type of art, and like it has its own style. Just by reading intro that we read, we've already tainted our view of this because we have more information about it. You know,
I didn't have that going in. All I had were her words and all of the presuppositions of life.
Right.
That knowing nothing about her,
you got to try to forget.
But you
or unlearn them in a sense.
But in a sense, it's
right.
We'll get to that.
Sure.
We'll continue part 2, and it's interesting because they say that interpretation is almost hostile to the nature of art.
That is a large point she spends a lot of time exploring that aspect of it.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah.
I don't know. Like, I see what she means, but again, maybe it's just us doing what we're doing at the time and the place we're doing it. I don't want to slander her in a sense, but let's be clear, she's basically a hippie writing about all this almost mechanized criticism that was happening probably at the time she was writing this. So she's sort of railing against the culture of criticism at that time, which
right.
is not the same as now. So so it's sort of broadly it's going to be rooted in a mindset that isn't our case.
And I think also in a broader sense, I kind of looked at it not so much as a consumer of art, but as a way to try and create art, like not to get bogged down in like trying to give your whatever you're creating a message per se, or like
she's openly hostile later to those who attempt to have any meaning in their art.
Right. But again, I'm not saying that I agree with that stance, but I think it is certainly a good exercise if you're an artist trying to create something to try to let your thing be itself as opposed to trying to layer on other messages.
But my counter argument to that is the absence of meaning itself.
Of course it is, but that's what
you can't escape the act of interpretation.
So the idea of doing something like that, at least for me, the whole reason I thought that would be a good way to do things is, of course, you're going to put meaning into what you do. However, that meaning is far more open to interpretation than hitting somebody over the head with it, like freaking meaning hammer,
like a sign. Sure. Well, she brings that up. She actually mentions the line outright in a later section about that. But yes, that's a valid point, and it stands here.
Well, I suppose then I am the enemy of art that she so fears.
Why do you hate art so much, Ian?
Because it doesn't have any meaning to it.
Wait, you're backing her up now.
Section 3, though, it moves on from the Greek history and goes to
sort of the modern, or it goes through
it goes through
touches points throughout.
Classical age,
but it does open with my favorite, or probably one of the best quotes I think from this essay, is that she to be clear, she says, "Of course, I don't mean interpretation in the broadest sense, the sense in which Nietzsche rightly says there are no facts, only interpretations. By interpretation, I mean here a conscious act of the mind which illustrates a certain code or certain rules in quotations of interpretation."
Right.
So
and that's what we mentioned.
She's railing against what we just
that's what we mentioned earlier. So she's saying that, of course, things are going to be interpreted. At least what I get out of this is, of course, things are going to be interpreted. I'm not saying that your interpretation of something is invalid, but what she is saying is that there's, I think, a certain way to go about trying to interpret art that she thinks is better than others.
Well, she thinks the current method at the time was flawed. It was too corporatized in a sense.
But she would hate our method of going.
Right, I understand that. She certainly would.
But so she starts off with quoting Nietzsche, and it goes with basically the argument that things are subjective and not objective. That, of course, there's an interpretation in the broad sense that we all view the world differently. Kind of respect her if this was what she was intending. This is my interpretation of her words. The attempt to define objectivity in a work, and a definite, through the use of personal. So you're saying this is the correct interpretation of
what she says that
this
too.
Artwork.
Don't you see that X really means Y or whatever? Yeah.
Right. I mean, I think that's what she's railing against, as opposed to you should see this for what it is to you, regardless of what people are telling you that it means. I think that's really what she's against here, even though making her way through her own thoughts on the subject throughout the essay.
Maybe I was so hostile to this after I read the first part, but that's a fair point.
You don't like it because she was hating on your method of interpreting art.
I loved Aristotle because he was loving my method.
Yes. Yeah.
So then they go into the kind of classical use of interpretation, which was to moralize past works to fit the current trend. So, an example, Christianity looking back at the Old Testament and reinterpreting that.
I think she uses revamping it so it fits their current mindset.
The classical scholars going back, they look at like Zeus and Homeric epics and saying that, well, you had to. They weren't really saying that Zeus raped this woman. It's a metaphor for the attaining of wisdom or something like that, which I think is a fair point for a lot of the initial academic sense of interpretation, where it's trying to formalize a method of interpretation in a way.
Well, I'll read it. I'll read her own words about it. It says, she writes, "Interpretation is a radical strategy for conserving an old text which is thought too precious to repudiate by revamping it. The interpreter, without actually erasing or rewriting the text, is altering it, but he can't admit to doing this. He claims to only be making it intelligible by disclosing its true meaning."
Right.
And I think that was one of her better points. That it seems true to me that was happening, or it is a consequence of some kinds of interpretation of certain texts.
That's the thing is, I would argue that is an evil of interpretation, but just because that happens doesn't make all interpretation
I agree with that point.
And at the end of this section, she says something that I think is the clearest view of what I think she's trying to get out throughout this entire essay, where she says, "Thus, interpretation is not an absolute value, a gesture of mind situated in some timeless realm of capabilities. Interpretation must itself be evaluated within a historical view of human consciousness. In some cultural contexts, interpretation is a liberating act, is a means of revising, of transvaluing, of escaping the dead past. In other cultural contexts, it is reactionary, impertinent, cowardly, stifling." So
which is the one she's really
clearly she's all right with this certain form of interpretation that brings something that is dead to a new audience, but she's against the interpretation that is, as she says, reactionary.
But there's a moment when she kind of becomes hypocritical of that by performance of a Streetcar Named Desire, which we'll get to a little bit. So remind me of this point.
Yeah, I was going to make that was an interesting little example that she brought up, and we'll talk about it.
To finish this off, she hits Marx and Freud as, in a sense, the forefathers of the evils of modern interpretation.
They created the monster of interpretation in the method that she dislikes. Yes.
But what's interesting is when I took literary criticism classes, her idea of viewing it historically was a method of literary criticism. Yeah,
sure.
But while also psychoanalysis was, and also like the political, like it seems to me that she is unconsciously promoting a sense of interpretation while railing against other people doing different forms.
I definitely got that sense of it, like at least by the end of it, and that's why I left it sort of with feeling not great about what her intent didn't match up with what she actually came to state within it at points. If not,
I will really agree, because I feel that it starts devolving in the second half when she starts lambasting people for...
Right. If I may condense it, it's as if she's saying, hey, stop interpreting stuff at all. No, wait, actually, here's how you should interpret it. If you're going to interpret it at all. If you're going to do it, here's the right way. The right way to interpret things is the way that I am writing it to you.
Oh, Scott, you're being reactionary, impertinent, cowardly, and stifling.
Always, of course. Yes.
So that's the end of section 4, or 3. We're moving on to section 4.
Which, let me quickly jump in, because this, early on in section 4, contains, how should I say this, a marker, I guess, of her sensibilities, the way she phrases it again. She writes, the last sentence Steve just read, I'll read it again real quick. In other cultural contests, it is reactionary, impertinent, cowardly, stifling. 4 starts with, today is such a time, when the project of interpretation is largely reactionary, stifling, like the fumes of the automobile and of heavy industry, which befoul the urban atmosphere. It's sort of a hippie thing, like, you're smothering me with your interpretation, man.
No,
more or less.
This is where she really lost me.
Right.
In a culture whose already classical dilemma is the hypertrophy of the intellect at the expense of energy and sensual capability, interpretation is the revenge of the intellect upon art.
Yeah.
Now, for any of you
She's calling us out for being elitists, pretty much.
To anyone who listens to our podcasts, you know that I am a huge fan of over-interpretation. I love doing it. And it's not... Yes, I do it for the purpose... It's my own art form. It's my intellectual art form.
I was going to say that. It's your art, man.
I enjoy, like...
It's your revenge upon those who create art because you're not creating it.
Yeah, but it's not...
But that's what she's saying to you.
I know, and I feel that perhaps it's unfair to the point of the original piece, but...
You felt insulted by it. I get it.
But if you want to listen to Freud, who is saying that there is... we'll discuss... I actually want to bring up later after we're done with this, really going into all the kind of methods that interpretation. So, and I want to kind of challenge her on this point, offer my own thesis. Anyone else have anything on 4?
No, because it's quite short, and I just wanted to point out that
basically just says, we're terrible people.
Yeah.
Okay. So now we're on to section 5, which is basically on literature. Because she says that literature is the most susceptible form of art to be preyed upon by those who wish to befoul it with interpretation.
Yes. I will admit that she opens up each section with a sort of a polarizing quote.
Right. And
I'll read, if you allow me to read section 5, it opens with, in most modern instances, interpretation amounts to the Philistine refusal to leave the work of art alone. Which, again, it's going to be not like a wishy-washy statement. She's calling it out for that very thing.
Yeah, to that point, she goes into Kafka in some detail in this section, and she talks about the 3 types of Kafka interpreters. Those who read Kafka as a psychoanalytic allegory see desperate revelations of Kafka's fear of his father, his castration anxieties, his sense of his own impotence, his thraldom to his dreams. Or you can read it as a religious allegory. They explain that Kay in the castle is trying to gain access to heaven, that Joseph K. in the trial is being judged by the inexorable and mysterious justices of God. And then there's one of
social allegory.
As those who read it as social allegory see case studies in the frustrations and insanity of modern bureaucracy and its ultimate issuance in the totalitarian state. And I think that she's trying to say that none of these actually have it right. The way that I always look at interpreting things is I'm not trying to pin down what the author thought. I'm trying to pin down what I think about what the author or artist gave us, which I think is what she is saying is the way to go.
Well, maybe, but just again, that I want to point out sort of a flaw in that little example is why can't I have all those interpretations of Kafka or of anything, of multiple interpretations? Why she's like 1, 2, and 3, you can do it this way, or this other way, but
no, she's saying that people that are judging Kafka split into basically three.
Right, and she's saying each one has sort of its flaws because it's only judging at one little value or aspect. But there's a way to get them all, I would think.
But earlier on, you said as an interpretation of her words, and yes, I'm overusing that on point, was that works of art should be open to whatever interpretation you want. And then she's challenging people who have those interpretations.
No.
You're not having the correct ones.
I think she's challenging the fact that there are camps. That there are specific, 3 main camps of interpretation.
Yeah, I got that sense of it.
Where,
but it still
as
seems...
these people are saying, this is what this work of art means, as opposed to, this is what this work of art means to me personally.
Right, but it still seems hypocritical in a sense. I think that's maybe what E and I are sort of saw in that.
But I don't think it is. I think that there's a difference between people telling you what something means, as opposed to you interpreting.
That's why I said it seems like that.
You think it means.
It's an interpretation, of course.
Actually, I want to make 2 points based on literary reference. One, she also mentions Beckett.
She does.
I'm a huge fan of Waiting for Godot, which is a fascinating example of that a work that can be interpreted in many different ways. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people see Waiting for God because Godot, but that's not particularly accurate because it was originally.
Hey, don't tell people what to think, man.
No, according to it's really French, and it's more of a reference to feet or something like that, or boots. But then Beckett later on said that, yeah, perhaps it is. It was an unconscious choice on my part that it referenced God there. There's also a reference to another podcast we did, which was Good Man is Hard to Find. A literary critic actually chastised the author, saying that she had been influenced by the popular culture interpretation of the work that
of her own very work.
Yeah, that didn't fit in with what her original intent was.
Right.
Well, so if interpretation is so fluid that even the author may not change their mind upon what the meaning of their work is, why is one better than the other?
She herself said, as I read earlier, but I also want to point out to that point, in addition, she goes on to say in section 5 that sometimes the writer will be so uneasy before the power of his art that he will instill within the work itself, albeit with a little shyness and a touch of the good taste of irony, the clear and explicit interpretation of it. In the case of more stubborn authors, the critic is only too happy to perform the job. So she's saying it's almost like those people, anyone who produces a work of art in which they purposely impart meaning for it, somehow their work is devalued for that.
Even more to that point, and this is the Streetcar Named Desire.
That's what I was just going to remind you of.
I think this is such a fascinating example of hypocrisy that, okay, so Tennessee Williams wrote the Streetcar Named Desire, and Susan Sontag is discussing Elia Kazan's production of it, where Kazan was adding in her own thematic elements to this, her own interpretation. Now, in a way, and she's challenging that this is not what the original intent of Tennessee Williams is. But she earlier said about the reproduction of works and the idea of new versions of it. So why is Kazan at fault for creating her own interpretation of this work because it didn't match with Sontag's interpretation of Williams's work?
On this, I actually agree with you. I don't think that, because I think she's going against herself because this was Kazan directed it, was the director's vision of the play. So it was the director's own interpretation. I guess what her beef is with this is that Elia Kazan tries to impart an overall meaning that perhaps was not originally there, or what. There's no one to say whether it was or not.
Well, she
go back and go ahead.
She directly then continues about in section 6. Section 5 ends with the Streetcar Named Desire example, what she says about it. And then she immediately says, it doesn't matter whether artists intend or don't intend for the works to be interpreted. Perhaps Williams thinks Streetcar is about what Kazan thinks it to be about as well. But the merit of these works certainly lies elsewhere than in their, quote, meanings. Which I felt that was a weird thing to say.
Especially to go back to part 3 when she says, in some cultural contexts, interpretation is a liberating act. It means revising, of transvaluing, of escaping the dead past. Yeah. Not that the Streetcar Named Desire was dead at that point, but it's
regardless, it was
transvaluing.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. So it's okay if other cultures do it, but not American.
Well, it's like
culture.
it's okay in case X and Y, but she's not really saying like what cases precisely it's going to be. And it's sort of she randomly picked this out of a hat as an example of one she dislikes, even though earlier she said on the opposite side of the coin it could be one that's perfectly in quotes acceptable to her method of thinking.
So we're now on to section 6, since that did have a weird half transition. So I think there's 2 sections of this. The first one briefly describes works that have intended to be obscure in their ability to be interpreted. And I feel that she's kind of against that in a way, saying that like you're trying too hard to I don't know what if you guys have that
kind like I got a bit of a sense of that, but it's weird. Like as we discuss more and more, it's almost as if she's saying don't interpret it this way, that way, but she's not saying what. I guess the whole thing is against interpretation at all, in a sense. Which just I don't know. The whole theory that it rests on is sort of odd to me.
She does say, she's talking about last year in Marienbad, she says that creators consciously designed it to accommodate a multiplicity of equally plausible interpretations. But,
right.
She continues, but the temptation to interpret Marienbad should be resisted. What matters is the pure, untranslatable, sensuous immediacy of some of its images, rigorous, if narrow, solutions to certain problems of the cinematic form. Which, I think, again,
get it, but
is what I was going to say is that it's a little bit problematic in that if the creators of a thing
allowed for multiple interpretations.
Actually, no. I think what she's saying is that regardless of the creator's vision for it, that shouldn't necessarily be your vision. You should take it as the work of art that it is and interpret it. And maybe I'm just completely wrong about this, but like
you are, as always, completely wrong.
But the way that I read this, I kind of feel like, despite the fact that she kind of stumbles through this a little bit, because I think at the time of writing she was trying to figure it out herself.
Yeah, but
how
that
she
much
felt
is obvious,
about it.
and that's what she said about it.
And
sure.
I think the main hypothesis that I got out of this is that you should resist having other people tell you what the interpretation of a work is, and just view it as innocently as you can and take from it what you personally take from it.
I would be fine with that interpretation, except for the fact that she rails.
Exactly.
Okay, to quote in this section, it is always the case that interpretation of this type indicates a dissatisfaction, conscious or unconscious, with the work, a wish to replace it by something else. Yes, she's referring to more of the Freudian or Marxist kind of interpretations where you're seeing a tank going down a street in The Silence by Ingmar Bergman, who she also hates. We're going to get into that in a little bit. But it's the idea that's a phallic symbol. I'm kind of a Freudian guy. I think that there is that kind of unconscious implications in works, especially visual works. And
or at least there can be.
Yes.
Right. And so like I think what you're saying, let me agree with you sort of and add on to it. I agree with you that I really hate the way she phrased that. It's always the case that indicates dissatisfaction. No, I mean you can get something else out of it. You might not be dissatisfied. You could see something else as a symbol.
For instance, there's a thing that Tarantino has a foot fetish or something like that. And yes, if you pick that up, even if he intended it consciously or unconsciously, that doesn't devalue his works. That adds
I agree.
Like an element of interesting insight into who the creator is.
Again, I think we can agree that perhaps some of her points are valid, but the way she presents them is not perhaps the best way that could have been done in the essay.
So let's move on to section 7 now.
All right. This one has one of my little phrase that I liked.
Oh, go on.
Which she says interpretation doesn't always prevail. In fact, a great deal of today's art, again contemporary to her time, may be understood as motivated by a flight from interpretation. To avoid interpretation, art may become parody, or may become abstract, or may become, in quotes, merely decorative, or may become non-art. Which I think parody is now, in our day and age, perhaps the prevalent art form in and of itself.
This also has one of my favorite quotes by her. For example, a few of the films of Bergman though crammed with lame messages about the modern spirit, thereby inviting interpretations, still triumph over the pretentious intentions of their director. And again, like, this is what I feel, the hostility she has towards it, and it grows as she's writing this.
Yeah, and let me read you the next one. She says, most American novelists and playwrights are really either journalists or gentlemen sociologists and psychologists. They are writing the literary equivalent of program music. That's a pretty big insult. Like, she intended it as one, and I took it as one. You know, were I an actual novelist or playwright at the time. Like I said, it's almost like she's railing against the corporatization of criticism. And like I said, being a hippie and, you know, befouling the urban atmosphere with our fumes of criticism and so forth.
But this section actually opens up with her, and I would actually agree with this section, that the use of like modern art and kind of like abstract poetry, especially in the French style, was used to rebel against the overinterpretation.
Sure.
And I could see that as a thing. Although, again, I feel that the more abstract you go, the more you invite interpretation. It has
because of its very nature of it. I agree with it.
Right, of course. I think that all that is kind of this idea of trying to get away from interpretation. And I think she mentions music in here too, in this section.
No, well, she seems rather enamored by film, which, yes, sure, was an earlier medium at that point. I want to, would be very curious at what she thinks about films nowadays, and the interpretations of them.
And this also, I feel, where this starts...
Might be a big fan of Michael Bay.
No.
Very sensuous.
I actually feel this speaks to her, in a sense, classism here.
I somewhat see what you mean and mostly agree if I think you're going to say what I think you're going to say.
When she's talking about film, she goes, well, film before now, this is 1966, was for the masses.
Yeah.
So it didn't matter what it was about. Now film
it's
is,
becoming an capital A art form.
Yes. I think that the true intention behind this work, her mode of thought, can be really seen towards the end here. In a sense, its idea is that intellects are ruining art for me. That they're trying to drag it down, maybe not down to their level, but
like I said,
they're taking art.
All the corporate suits are stealing my art, man. Yeah. Like, you know, that's
in a sense,
to be facetious about it.
But that's what I get from this, and like, the way you describe it, Sivo, is very kind of that innocence there. But I'm like, again, I can't help it. I'm a product of the exact person she hates, and I can't help but try to like look at the themes behind what she's saying, the subtext of her sentences. And
apparently the greatest revenge of her intellect upon her essays is to in fact interpret the shit out of them. So
there we go.
Good on you.
Here it's saying that she's not a populist anymore. She's speaking for her artistic circle. And I think that becomes clear when she's talking about film. This is the last refuge we have.
I get a similar sense upon reading it. I agree.
Oh no, Steve, do you have a comment on that?
No, I think that you are right to an extent. I mean, I feel like she was kind of insulated when she was writing this in her own.
She was in her ivory tower.
Yeah, right. But I think that a lot of what she says stands overall. I mean, this section isn't really rife with too much for me. I actually kind of like the description of works that kind of defy interpretation and holding those up as kind of, you know, paragons of ways to do art that if you don't want to be interpreted, like, here's what you should be like focusing on. But
I'd be really curious what her thoughts on like Andy Warhol would have been, who would have done film of nothing happening for 24 hours type thing. Again, it's bothersome.
I get it.
Well, let me ask you this.
You're fundamentally opposed to.
Let me ask you this. Do you see those films as works of art?
My concern is with telling a story. If your purpose is to make yourself unintelligible to everyone but those within your circle, so
that there is no story to outsiders.
If you're being an obscutarianist.
Is that a word?
Yes.
Obscutarianist?
It is now, I suppose.
All right. We'll look it up later.
Then you're failing at creating a narrative structure, and this is what our entire project's about. Whether you can telling a story.
Sure. So then that means that some of this is irrelevant to us in a sense.
Well, I don't think she's interested in telling.
That's what I mean.
Especially not in like specific forms of art. She talks about all forms of art in this.
Yeah, but again,
there are certain forms of art that are not interested in a narrative.
And that's fair.
Well, again, let me read you one more line as we close off section 7 that I think sort of is a giveaway about her mindset and given the time and place. She says, "The fact that films have not been overrun by interpreters is in part due simply to the newness of the cinema as art." That probably isn't true today. That's what I mean. You know what I mean? So again, it's a very beholden to a certain time and place and mindset, which is not going to be, by the fact of time itself, was true then perhaps, but is not now.
I disagree with it. I believe that there exists still those with this mindset. Those that...
maybe, but I'm just saying the example she uses is no longer valid.
They would find another modern form of technology to
point somehow, to and say that about it. Yeah, sure, perhaps.
They're the frontier of art.
Right.
And again, if...
Vines.
I'm more of an Aristotelian. The idea that if your work has no purpose, then it
is purposeless.
Yes.
It's a great tautology, but sure.
Don't think that you can say that any, despite the if something doesn't have a narrative, that doesn't mean it doesn't have a purpose.
Then if your point is to defy meaning, I don't think that you're establishing yourself.
But just by doing that, you're establishing a whole new form that can be looked at.
And I will bitterly, like Aristotle, rail against it.
Sure. Well, that's interesting because...
Well, I mean, a lot of, just because it's not what you're into doesn't mean that it is not a proper form of art.
Well, I think that's a good segue because Section 8 is all about the form, like talking about the form of art, which I think if we're trying to draw any parallels whatsoever between this and Poetics, I think this is the one like equal to where he starts going off about language and so forth.
Yes.
It seems the most out of place and the most, of course, abstract because it's like she's struggling herself to define what she's trying to define and how we should all define it and what we should look at within it. So it was the most obtuse part of this entire essay, to me.
I got a weird sense
that
agree. She wishes that criticism of art would be artistic.
Yeah, that's a good paraphrase of, or what she's trying to get at. I think in this one,
like only art can judge art. Yeah,
but see that to me, like I would argue with that because it doesn't say anything. I interpret it as being devoid of meaning. So maybe that's what she wanted, and there she succeeded. There.
Well, I think she's trying to figure out what form of criticism actually serves.
Is the best way to.
Actually, she says this. The question is, let me go back a little bit. I'm not saying that the works of art are ineffable, that they cannot be described or paraphrased. They can be. The question is how. What would criticism look like that would serve the work of art, not usurp its place? And that's kind of...
Sure, but she has no answer for that.
That's kind of the
But also,
the whole
to
idea.
her point, equally valuable would be acts of criticism, which would supply a really accurate, sharp, loving description of the appearance of a work of art.
Right. I mean,
So
I don't think that...
It's not a criticism. It's a artistic love
circle
letter
jerk, if you will. Put more vulgarly, but yeah. I agree with that. That's what I'm saying. It was the most obtuse thing. She's like, this is what we should have. I don't know how to get it, like, essentially.
Right. I don't think that's what she wants. I don't know why she put that in there. I don't think that's what she wants. I don't think she wants a sharp, accurate description of something.
Can't say what she wants or not.
We can only judge by what is there, what is present. So...
Right, but based off of everything else that she's written in here, I don't think that's what it's not like I know a ton about Susan Sontag and I'm bringing that in. But what I mean is, though, that this section here seems out of place where she says
that's what I was saying
equally valuable would be acts of criticism which supply accurate, sharp, loving descriptions, which I don't think that's what she's been saying this entire time. And that I think that's one of the points in this essay where it's like she's, like I said before, just kind of like stumbling to try and find what she actually thinks.
Right. Well, let's finish off with that where she says what you just read, and then she goes on to say, this seems even harder to do than a formal analysis. She names a couple of essays that she basically likes that did what she just said, and then goes on. She's like, here are 3 essays that I think did what I want it to be like.
These are essays which reveal the sensuous surface of art without mucking about in it.
Yeah, whatever that means. Like,
these give loving portrayals without having
saying, it means this.
Without any sharp pointed objective I understand that she doesn't want an objective view of what good art is.
Right.
But without any objectivity, it just becomes everything is good because there's nothing to compare
Without
against.
critics to tell us what's dumb, we'd all be wearing fucking rocks for hats. There has to be some kind of delineation. Anyways, so that's section 8.
Well, that's all of 8, yeah.
All right, we have 2 more sections, which the last section is 1 sentence, so we'll combine
I think
the two.
9 might be the one I got into the most.
I could see why, because it's the most narrative-like.
Yeah, perhaps that's why I like it, sure.
But it's also the thing that I feel at its heart, it's reiterating that Paradise Lost message. That there was this, once upon a time in her
idealized
this moment.
World of art,
Yes,
where art was not tainted by criticism, more or less.
And, once upon a time, say, for Dante, it must have been a revolutionary and creative move to design works of art so that they might be experienced on several levels.
Now it is not. Yeah, I was waiting to bring that quote up.
What, did you have something?
No, I mean, perhaps she's just... I mean, I'm not really sure what she's getting at there. I'm not sure what the underlying idea that she wants to portray is. Because...
Yeah, well, if you let me try to pick at it a bit, right? She says, "Oh yeah, like goes back to your idealized thing. Back then, sure, it was a great new and creative idea to have multiple layers. Now, but why is that no longer valid to her? Like, you know what I mean? She offers no counter or no going on to say about why not.
It seems that she's saying that, and she even mentions it reinforces the principle of redundancy. It seems that,
wait, hold on. Let's finish that quote. Read that entire sentence, please.
All right. So it reinforces the principle of redundancy that is the principal affliction of modern life.
It is like, again, it's hippie.
Basically what it seems to her is that all art should be like original, and if you're copying in some way something else, then you're not creating real art.
But if she wants to return to the beginning, then she's retreating. Yeah. She's copying what existed already.
Exactly, and her own works are based off of other things that came before her. Obviously, as everything is, in some way, we're all standing on the graves of the people that came before us.
The shoulder of giants. All right, so let's go on. She sort of reuses that format, Once Upon a Time for Dante, and then she follows it up with Once Upon a time when high art was scarce. It must have been a revolutionary and creative move to interpret works of art. Now it is not. What we decidedly do not need now is further to assimilate art, capital art, into capital T thought, or worse yet, art, capital, into capital C culture. But isn't art already part of culture? That's the thing I disagree with.
Not her art. Her art is above culture.
Somehow. But that doesn't... That's really odd to me.
To her point on Dante, when he wrote that, who was interpreting Dante? The church. In a way, modern day, or when she was writing this, and even more so today, there's per capita a greater level of intellects with a diverse view of things. So yes, you have, back during Dante, Freud didn't exist, Marx didn't exist. They didn't view the political, there were political interpretations of Dante, there were religious interpretations of Dante, but you didn't have psychology, you didn't have all these different methods of governing.
Sure, right.
And nowadays, yes, there are. It's more sectarian in a way, but is that a bad thing? Is it people having the ability to interpret something differently?
She thinks it is because she's a hippie, and I'm going to read you the final closing off quote from section 9. Again, it's similar to the one earlier where she says, "Ours is a culture based on excess, the conflicting taste of odors and sights of the urban environment that bombard our senses, overproduction. The result is a steady loss of sharpness in our sensory experience."
She goes on to say later, which actually I think is probably the most concise summing up of what she wants to say in this. And she says, "Our task is not to find the maximum amount of content in a work of art, much less to squeeze more content out of the work than is already there. Our task is to cut back content so that we can see the thing at all."
Sure, which is fine until the very last thing, to see the thing at all. It's a tautology again. That her closing off of this of section 9, which might as well be the end of it. She says after that, she says the function of criticism should be to show how it is what it is, it being art, even that it is what it is, rather than to show what it means. But to me, that's a completely meaningless, moot statement. Oh, a picture is obviously a picture. I can see it. How do you criticize in such a way?
I feel that maybe I don't understand her point, Maybe I need an interpreter.
Maybe that's the point.
This. But should my entire review of this have been... This was a essay written by Susan Sontag. It was printed in a book, a collection of essays. Yeah, we're done. That's showing what it is.
You're now the greatest critic ever because you're following her rules.
But not at all discussing
what it means. Yes. Well, you've just become an amazing critic according to her own scales.
Right.
But what have you said exactly?
I kind of feel bad. I don't agree with almost anything she wrote in here.
Right. I largely also agree with you and thus disagree with her too on many points that we've just said. So you want to close off with Section 10 now? I have something to say about that too. Why don't you read off the one sentence that composes Section 10?
All right, I'm going to butcher this word, so I apologize.
It's hermeneutics.
In place of a hermeneutics, we need an erotics of art.
Right. So to what you just said, don't read her essay, just fuck the book, apparently, and then you'll have a sensual artistic experience.
Classy, sir.
Yes, and you will be a critic in line with her own sensibilities.
Yes, you shouldn't... in a way, I agree with her in the sense that you shouldn't be watching or reading something and trying to figure out the meaning behind every line to the point where you don't even enjoy. You don't see the forest for the trees.
Right.
But if you're reading it with...
If you're going the opposite way with trying to get zero meaning out of it because that's a pointless endeavor, then it becomes a pointless endeavor, it seems to me.
I'm a huge fan of Dostoevsky. If you read The Brothers Karamazov with the surface view of it, you wouldn't get all of the
nuances.
Is he a failed novelist because he has hidden meanings and multi-layers and...
No, it's just the corporate...
Well, I think that Susan Sontag would say that he succeeded in spite of trying to layer it then that way. And like I said, I disagree with a lot of what's in this essay, but at the same time, I find it a very useful way to view the creation of something. Creating something for the sake of itself is, I think, a useful endeavor if you're creating something at all. I don't think that you necessarily want to go in trying to hit somebody over the head with with all your meaning.
Sure, that wasn't... I don't think that was what she was railing against, per se.
Specifically, she referenced how that's a bad...
Creating just a work of art?
No, creating a work of art with meaning
within it?
Yeah.
That's what I'm saying.
Yes and no, but...
I view this not necessarily as I'm not going to take it as gospel, obviously.
Fair enough.
But I kind of like a lot of things that are said in terms of taking them as an exercise viewing something in that way as an exercise in and of itself.
I'll say I found it an interesting read, even if I find myself further and further getting into it, not liking it because she seemed to contradict herself about various things. And the broad point that she was making anyway, as Ian said, that we agree that we don't quite agree with what she was trying to impart about art, or at least about interpreting or being a critic of it.
Perhaps, though, I am simply biased. This is written against everything. I went in to make a...
Well, it's challenging your set of values, sure.
The MOTS system is all about creating a objective interpretation of a narrative structure, which is everything she's against.
Yeah, it's everything she hates.
And perhaps we are at war. Perhaps I am the enemy of her. And perhaps she's the enemy of me.
Well, you're just in different philosophical, critical camps. Yeah, sure.
Well, you've outlived her at this point.
Yeah.
What?
So you've outlived her at this point, so winner.
So I'm going to make if anyone out there who's listening is in the Susan Sontag camp and wants to give us a rebuttal, feel free. Send us either essay, video...
whatever response in whatever medium you so choose.
Yeah,
all emoticons, whatever.
Yeah. Especially all emoticons. So we have to interpret them. At contact@thelostsignals.com. I'm Jonathan E. Minzer here with Scott Dola.
And I will be befouling your urban environment with the stench of my own criticism sometime soon. Good night.
Stephen Orozco.
I got that. Have a good night, guys.
Interpret that as you will. This has been the Neophytes of Narratology. We hope that you've experienced an epiphany or two of the literary nature, but only metaphorically, of course. Music by Christopher Morgan. Editing and engineering by Jonathan Ian Minzer.